I'm a 28-year-old guy, and my family's always been close-knit, but in a way that, looking back, might have been too close. You know, the kind of family where everyone knows each other's business, and somehow it's always about helping each other out. My parents made it clear they expected me to step up whenever they needed support, especially financially. They'd frame it like I was their rock, the dependable one, and I didn't question it much, until recently. Now, my sister is the golden child. She's always been treated like she could do no wrong, and while I tried not to let it bother me, it did. She'd get into little messes, credit card debt, bad investments, and my parents would cover it up or excuse it. Meanwhile, whenever they needed help, I was the one they came to. I even helped pay off some of her previous debts, though it wasn't something I wanted to do. I figured it was just what families did. Things took a turn when I noticed my credit score had tanked, seemingly out of nowhere. I'd been careful with my finances, making sure I wasn't missing payments on anything. I was genuinely confused, so I dug into my credit report, trying to figure out what was going on. That's when I saw it, a loan I'd never taken out. It was massive, and the details didn't match anything I'd ever signed up for. Panic set in. I spent hours going over everything, and eventually I realized someone had taken out the loan in my name. I pieced things together bit by bit, realizing that the only people who could have accessed the information needed to take out that loan were my parents. When I confronted them, they didn't deny it. They just sat there, looking at me like I'd accused them of stealing a cookie or something. My dad even laughed, saying they did it for the family and that I should understand. According to him, they were helping my sister with some emergency expenses, and since they were all family, they didn't think it'd be a big deal. They were acting like they'd borrowed a few bucks for gas, not taken out a huge loan in my name. I tried explaining how badly this could mess things up for me, but they brushed it off, saying they'd figure it out. They kept pushing this narrative that it was a loving gesture, helping my sister out. My anger kept growing, but they didn't seem to grasp the seriousness of what they'd done, or maybe they just didn't care. I tried talking to other family members, hoping someone might see my side and help me reason with my parents. That didn't go anywhere. Most of them sided with my parents, saying that family comes first, and it wasn't that big of a deal. They kept repeating the same lines, almost like they'd all rehearsed it. It felt like I was up against everyone I'd ever trusted. Frustrated and desperate, I started researching my options. I'd never been a confrontational person, especially with family, but I couldn't just ignore what they'd done. I learned that what they'd done was illegal identity theft, plain and simple. My parents had banked on me not knowing that or not wanting to go through with any legal action. They assumed I'd just let it go, like always. When I brought up legal consequences, they laughed it off. My mom even said, "You'd never do that to us," as if I'd owe them blind loyalty no matter what. My sister, on the other hand, acted like I was the problem. She didn't see any issue, almost like she was entitled to anything and everything from me. She said something along the lines of, "You wouldn't even have what you do if it weren't for all the sacrifices we made." That one hit hard. They were acting like I owed them my life. It was the turning point. I realized they weren't going to change or see reason. They saw me as a resource, not a person. So I made the decision to consult a lawyer. When my family found out, they were shocked, almost offended. My parents kept messaging, calling, trying to guilt trip me, saying I was tearing the family apart and acting dramatic. My sister even hinted that she'd be ruined if I went through with it, as if I should keep this loan on my record to protect her. My friends were the only ones who actually seemed to understand. They kept telling me to go through with it, to stand up for myself, and not let my family walk all over me. Their support was the only thing keeping me sane, honestly. I'd never gone up against my family like this, and the guilt was crushing, but the anger outweighed it. Eventually, I told my parents I was giving them a chance to pay back the loan quietly and without dragging this through the courts. They didn't even consider it. They thought I was bluffing, saying I'd come around. But I'd had enough. I decided to move forward with the lawsuit, even though it meant cutting myself off from them. As expected, they weren't happy. They stopped talking to me completely, acting as if I was the one who'd wronged them. I decided to post about it on Reddit, hoping for advice or at least some reassurance that I wasn't insane for wanting to hold my family accountable. Part of me still felt guilty, but I couldn't just stand by while they ruined my future to cover my sister's mistakes. So here I am, standing on the edge of one of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make, about to face the fallout from this family mess. Update 1. After making the decision to go forward with a lawsuit, I filed the legal paperwork. It felt unreal handing over the documents that would officially serve my own parents, but it was done. They didn't take it well, as I'd expected. When my parents got the papers, their reaction was classic. They acted completely blindsided, as if this whole thing came out of nowhere. My mom called, sounding hurt, saying she had no idea I'd actually go through with it. My dad's tone was more disbelief, like he was genuinely shocked I'd do this to the family. They kept saying they thought I was bluffing, that they assumed I'd just calm down. But there was no more bluffing, and I wasn't about to calm down after they'd taken out a loan in my name without a single ounce of remorse. It didn't take long for the family group chat to light up. At first, it was just my parents, but then my aunts, uncles, and even cousins started chiming in. I was getting bombarded with messages, all saying I was selfish for taking things this far. Everyone had an opinion, and somehow, none of them saw it my way. I'd gone from dependable to ungrateful overnight, apparently. The messages kept pouring in, accusing me of tearing the family apart over a misunderstanding. As if the group chat wasn't enough, my parents started messaging me individually, pulling out every card they could think of. Guilt trips, emotional blackmail, you name it. They'd write things like, "This is breaking our hearts," or "You're choosing money over family." My mom even tried to remind me of the sacrifices they'd made for me, saying they'd always put me first, which couldn't have felt further from the truth. On top of all that, my credit score kept taking a hit. Every time I checked, it seemed to drop a little more. The loan in my name was still unpaid, and the interest was piling up. I was worried about how long this would go on, but there was no way I was going to back down just to save my credit score. It was about more than that. Then the phone calls started coming in from extended family, people I hadn't spoken to in months, maybe even years. I could tell they'd all been talking, and they had this rehearsed script, like they were a united front. They'd call to check in, but then turn it into a lecture about family loyalty and how I should just forgive and forget. According to them, family came first no matter what, but it felt like family only meant something when it benefited my parents or sister. While my family was piling on, my friends were the only ones really supporting me. They kept reminding me why I was doing this and encouraging me not to let my family's manipulation get to me. I don't think I would have stayed sane without them. Things took another turn when my sister started reaching out. She was saying she'd be destroyed financially if I went through with the lawsuit, that I'd ruin her life over a stupid mistake. She tried making it sound like I was being unreasonable, like I was the one causing her all this pain. But every word out of her mouth just made it more obvious that she felt entitled to my support, like it was my job to clean up her messes. And then came the social media fallout. My family wasn't content with just the family group chat and personal messages. They decided to air everything online, posting vague statuses about being betrayed by those closest to you and how money changes people. They painted me as the greedy, ungrateful son, conveniently leaving out the part where they took out a huge loan in my name without permission. They knew exactly what they were doing, trying to paint themselves as the victims. All the drama online and within my family made it hard to stay focused, but my lawyer was a big help. He reassured me that I had a solid case and reminded me that the law was on my side. He went over my rights, the next steps, and what to expect. He was calm and professional, which helped steady me. I needed that reassurance, especially since my family was acting like I was completely in the wrong. My parents tried one last move to get me to drop the case, a private family meeting. They reached out saying we could just talk it over like family. They made it sound like it'd all be settled if I just showed up, apologized, and dropped everything. I told them I'd only come if they committed to paying back the loan. No dodging, no misunderstandings, they refused. After that, I knew I needed to block them, at least temporarily. I'd given them every chance, and every time they'd just try to manipulate me back into dropping it. So I blocked their numbers and cut off all the noise. The silence was almost a relief, even though part of me still felt guilty. But I had to focus on the case, and I couldn't keep letting them mess with my head. Finally, the court date was set. Seeing it on paper, having an actual date to look forward to, made it all feel very real. It was like a countdown to the moment where I'd finally have the chance to make my case in front of someone who'd listen objectively. With all this going on, I posted an update on Reddit. I wanted to share what had happened and maybe get some advice. The support from everyone there was overwhelming. It was like a tidal wave of validation that yes, what my parents did was messed up and I wasn't overreacting. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. Update 2. As the court date drew closer, my family's tactics ramped up. It was almost as if they thought that, by turning up the pressure, I'd cave and drop the case. One of their first moves was starting a rumor campaign. I'd hear from mutual friends and distant relatives that they were saying things about me, things that weren't just untrue but downright bizarre. Stories about me being ungrateful, rumors that I was only doing this because I was greedy or that I'd always had a rebellious streak. They were spinning a whole narrative that made me look like the black sheep, trying to ruin my own family out of spite. My parents even tried sending me apologies, but it was clear they weren't genuine. They'd send long, emotional messages about how much they loved me and wanted to keep the family together, but the underlying message was always the same. If I dropped the case, we could all move past this unfortunate misunderstanding. The words sounded hollow, like they'd rehearsed them, and there wasn't a single acknowledgement of what they'd done or any offer to fix it. They just wanted me to let it go and pretend it never happened. Then, things escalated. I got a letter from their lawyer, saying they were filing a countersuit against me. In their claim, they argued that I owed them for raising me, for all the years of sacrifices. The countersuit was built on this idea that I was somehow in debt to them for my entire existence. It was ridiculous, but I could see the strategy. They wanted to scare me into backing down by threatening a drawn-out legal battle. Word of the countersuit spread, and relatives who'd been quietly supporting me started distancing themselves. I guess they didn't want to be caught in the middle of what was quickly turning into a massive family feud. Some stopped answering my calls, others outright told me they didn't want to be involved. It felt like my parents were winning, managing to isolate me from the family one person at a time. Meanwhile, my sister reached out again. She sent this long message detailing all the ways she'd suffer if I went through with the lawsuit. She painted a picture of herself as the victim, saying she'd be financially ruined, that I was heartless for dragging her into this, and that she didn't deserve to have her life destroyed. She conveniently left out the part where she'd benefited from the loan taken out in my name. I couldn't help but see her message as another attempt to make me feel guilty. Despite everything, my lawyer and I kept moving forward. We focused on gathering as much evidence as possible. The more we dug, the more financial manipulation we uncovered, transactions, forged signatures, all sorts of red flags that painted a clear picture of my parents' behavior. It felt good to have something concrete, proof that showed I wasn't crazy for taking this stand. While all this was happening, my family ramped up their social media campaign. They posted vague but obvious updates saying things like some people betray their own blood for money, or when you give someone everything, and they throw it back in your face. They were fishing for sympathy, and it worked. Friends and extended family members who didn't know the full story would comment, sending their support and saying things like, "Stay strong, family is all that matters." They were building a whole public image of themselves as the victims, and I was the ungrateful son tearing the family apart. Out of nowhere, I got a message from an estranged uncle I hadn't spoken to in years. He said he'd heard what was going on and that he wanted to help. He told me he'd seen similar behavior from my parents years ago, which was one of the reasons he distanced himself from the family. He offered to testify on my behalf, saying he could provide context about their long-standing manipulation tactics. It was a surprising twist, but I appreciated it, especially since most of my family had abandoned me. In the middle of all this, my parents tried one last offer. They said they'd pay back a small fraction of the loan if I agreed to drop the lawsuit. They framed it as a gesture of goodwill, as if throwing a few dollars my way would make up for everything. My lawyer advised against it, reminding me that we had a strong case. It felt like a trap, a way to make me back down just enough for them to keep a hold over me. I refused the offer without a second thought. A few days later, I ran into my family at a local store. I hadn't expected it, and the situation quickly turned ugly. They didn't hold back, accusing me of abandoning them in their time of need. My dad got heated, his voice loud enough to draw attention, telling me that I was betraying everything they'd done for me. My mom looked on, saying I was the reason the family was falling apart. The whole thing was chaotic, and I left as quickly as I could. The confrontation rattled me, but it only strengthened my resolve. After that, I received another letter from their lawyer, a more intimidating one this time. It listed all the potential consequences if I continued with the case, suggesting that things could get messy and drawn out. I knew it was another scare tactic, but seeing it in writing made everything feel heavier, like the full weight of what I was up against was bearing down. Despite everything, I couldn't turn back now. I'd come this far, and I wasn't going to let their manipulation win. I posted another update on Reddit, sharing all the drama with everyone who'd been following my story. The support from Redditors was massive, with people reminding me that I wasn't alone and that standing up for myself was worth it, no matter how hard it got. Their words helped me hold my ground, even as the situation with my family spiraled. As the court date got closer, I knew I was in for a battle, but there was no way I was backing down. Update 3. The first court appearance was tense. I was sitting across the room from my parents, who looked surprisingly put together, given the chaos they'd been stirring. My lawyer was calm and organized, and seeing the stack of paperwork he had in front of him was oddly comforting. As we got started, he laid out the case methodically, presenting evidence of the loan fraud and identity theft. He showed copies of documents that had been signed without my consent, bringing out every detail that proved my parents had crossed a line. Watching him work made it clear we were fully prepared. As my lawyer presented our case, the depth of the situation started to unfold in a way that was hard to ignore. My parents' lawyer tried to claim that the loan had been for family expenses, but our evidence told a different story. My lawyer showed documents that exposed the actual purpose of the loan, which had nothing to do with family necessities. It was all to cover my sister's personal debts, and that fact came across clearly in black and white. The turning point came when my uncle, the one who'd reached out after hearing about the case, took the stand. I hadn't known what he'd say, only that he had distanced himself from the family years ago for similar reasons. He talked about my parents' long history of financial manipulation, how they'd taken advantage of others in the family, often guilt-tripping or even coercing them into lending money they'd never see again. His testimony gave context to my actions and showed the judge that my decision to sue wasn't out of nowhere. The courtroom was silent, everyone listening intently to every word. Then came my sister's turn. She'd always kept a certain composure, especially when trying to convince me to drop the case, but under questioning, she started to crack. When asked about her financial involvement and whether she was aware of the loan taken out in my name, her answers wavered, her voice shook, and she struggled to respond coherently. Eventually, it became clear that she knew the loan was under my name and that she'd actively gone along with it. The more she talked, the more everyone could see how deep she was in this mess, too. My parents looked genuinely shocked that I'd actually gone through with it this far, as if they'd expected me to drop everything once things got serious. I could see their disbelief growing every time another piece of evidence was presented. When my lawyer asked them to respond to the documents and testimony, they looked defensive, trying to save face, but it was clear they hadn't prepared for this level of scrutiny. The judge listened to everything carefully, and I could tell she wasn't buying their defense. My parents tried to play the "we're just a family in need" card, painting themselves as the ones trying to hold the family together, but it wasn't working. The judge asked pointed questions, pressing them about why they hadn't considered other ways to address the debts instead of taking out a loan under my name. My parents stumbled through their answers, their confidence visibly fading. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I explained the emotional toll of finding out that the people I trusted most had not only betrayed me but had continued to manipulate and guilt-trip me when I tried to stand up for myself. I didn't go into dramatic details, just laid out the facts of how long this behavior had been going on and how it had finally reached a breaking point. My parents' lawyer tried a few aggressive tactics during cross-examination, trying to portray me as the rebellious son who didn't appreciate family loyalty. But my lawyer countered every claim smoothly, turning the focus back to the core issue: the loan taken out without my permission, the lack of remorse, and the trail of manipulation. At one point, my parents started arguing with each other openly. My dad blamed my mom for letting it get this far, while my mom shot back, saying she'd done it for the family. They were practically shouting, and the judge had to intervene to get things back on track. Watching them argue in front of the judge was embarrassing, and I could tell it didn't help their case. It was like the whole courtroom could see the dysfunction they'd tried so hard to hide. After the hearing ended, I started getting messages from people who'd been following the story on social media. Some were people I didn't even know, but they reached out saying they'd been in similar situations or just wanted to show support. It was surreal, but it also felt like validation from people who understood what it was like to deal with manipulative family members. The financial disclosures were the final blow. My parents had to reveal the extent of their debts and poor financial decisions, and even I was shocked by the numbers. I'd had no idea how far in over their heads they were. The court documents showed they'd been struggling for years but had hidden it from me, choosing to use my credit as a solution rather than face their problems head-on. Seeing it all laid out made it impossible for them to keep pretending they were blameless. The judge adjourned, setting another date to go over additional evidence, and I left the courtroom feeling like we'd made progress. It wasn't over, but we'd managed to expose so much already. That evening, I received a message from my parents, no apologies, just a straightforward disownment, telling me that I was no longer part of the family. It felt harsh, but it was also freeing in a way. They'd finally shown their true colors. I shared an update on Reddit, letting everyone know how the first hearing went and the shocking revelations that had come out. People's responses were overwhelming, showing solidarity and encouraging me to keep pushing forward. I could see now that I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was setting boundaries that I'd needed for a long time. Update 4. With the case heading toward a decision, I thought things would start to settle. Instead, my parents' lawyer reached out with a surprise. They were offering a settlement. At first, it seemed like they were ready to finally take responsibility, but when I went through the terms, it became clear this was just another manipulation. The settlement was structured so that technically they would repay a portion of the loan, but the majority of it would still be unpaid, left to me to cover. Even worse, the conditions focused heavily on supporting my sister, requiring that a portion of the settlement be funneled toward her ongoing debts. The offer wasn't a solution, it was a way to get me to back off without actually solving anything. Attached to the settlement offer was a letter from my parents, a long, drawn-out apology that felt hollow. They acknowledged the hurt this situation had caused, saying that they only did what they did out of love for the family. But it was clear they still didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, the extent of the damage they'd caused. The words felt empty, like they were saying just enough to cover their tracks. There was no real accountability, no admission that what they'd done was outright wrong. I brought everything to my lawyer. He took one look at the terms and immediately advised against accepting it. According to him, the settlement was legally flimsy and heavily skewed in their favor. He pointed out that if I signed it, I'd be locked into future obligations that would likely lead to even more financial strain. The whole thing was a trap, a way to make me drop the lawsuit without resolving the core issue. Despite my lawyer's advice, the guilt started creeping back. They were my parents, after all. Part of me wondered if I was being too harsh, if maybe this was their attempt at making amends, even if it was misguided. But every time I tried to convince myself to give in, I'd remember the relentless manipulation, the lies, and how they'd tried to ruin my reputation instead of taking responsibility. My friends and Reddit followers were firm in their support. I posted an update on the settlement offer, explaining the details and asking for advice. The responses were overwhelming, with countless people urging me not to give in. They pointed out that my parents hadn't changed, they were just trying a new tactic to control the situation. The support helped me see the offer for what it really was. As expected, my parents didn't take my refusal well. They escalated things quickly, telling family members I was unforgiving and heartless for not wanting to settle. They began posting even more on social media, sharing vague statements about how difficult it was to watch their own child destroy the family for money. The guilt trips went public, and people who didn't know the whole story started commenting in their favor, offering sympathy and even taking jabs at me indirectly. Ignoring it was hard, but I knew that I had to keep going. The court date was still approaching, and this offer felt like a desperate attempt on their part to avoid the trial. They could sense they were losing, and they were scrambling for any way out. Instead of backing down, I asked my lawyer to prepare for a full trial. There was no more middle ground here. Around that time, an unexpected ally reached out, a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. She'd been aware of the family dynamics but had kept her distance, knowing how manipulative my parents could be. When she heard what was happening, she called to offer her support. She told me stories I hadn't heard before about how my parents had pulled similar stunts with other family members, borrowing money and never paying it back, relying on guilt and manipulation to keep people quiet. She said she wished she'd spoken up sooner, but she'd been afraid of the backlash. Her support gave me strength, knowing I wasn't alone in this, that others had seen the same behavior. Then, as if sensing that I was fully committed to going to trial, my parents sent one last message. It was a long, emotional letter, saying they couldn't believe I was willing to destroy the family over a misunderstanding. They painted themselves as the victims again, making one final plea for me to come to my senses and put the family first. It was hard to read, but it was clear that this wasn't about family, it was about control. I made my decision. I wasn't going to let guilt dictate my actions. I told my lawyer to move forward with full preparations for trial, and he got to work gathering everything we needed. He helped me understand what to expect and walked me through the process so that I felt fully prepared for whatever they'd throw at me. The weight of the situation was heavy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace about standing up for myself. With everything in motion, I posted another update on Reddit, sharing my decision to take this to trial and the manipulative settlement offer they'd tried to use against me. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. People thanked me for standing up, some even sharing similar stories about dealing with manipulative family members. It felt like I'd found a community that truly understood what I was going through. As the trial date approached, I knew I'd made the right choice. My parents could try all the guilt trips and social media posts they wanted, but I wasn't backing down. This was no longer just about the loan, it was about breaking free from the cycle they'd kept me in for years. It was about reclaiming my life and my sense of self-worth, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. Update 5. The final hearing came faster than I'd expected. I sat in the courtroom, facing my parents across the room. The months of manipulation, emotional blackmail, and legal battles had all led to this moment. My lawyer was calm, quietly reviewing our case notes one last time. My parents looked tense, as if they knew that their last-ditch settlement offer and social media theatrics hadn't done the trick. The judge entered, signaling the beginning of the end of this long ordeal. My lawyer went over our evidence clearly and concisely, the documents showing the loan taken out in my name without consent, the records of financial misuse, and the testimonies that highlighted my parents' pattern of manipulation. The judge listened intently, taking in every piece of evidence. After my lawyer presented our side, my parents' lawyer tried once more to frame the situation as a family misunderstanding. He emphasized that they had only wanted to support my sister and had never intended to cause me harm. But there was little they could say that hadn't already been picked apart by our evidence. It was clear to everyone in that room that this wasn't some innocent mistake. Finally, the judge looked up and delivered the ruling. She declared in my favor, confirming that the loan had been taken out fraudulently and ordering my parents to repay the full amount. The debt would no longer be tied to me, and I would be free from the financial burden they had placed on my shoulders. The judge also imposed minor penalties on them for the fraud, a clear message that their actions had legal consequences beyond our family drama. The moment the ruling was made, my parents lost their composure. My dad's face was red with anger, and my mom looked like she was on the verge of tears. Right there in the courtroom, they disowned me, announcing to anyone who would listen that I was no longer part of their family. My dad even shouted that I had destroyed the family over money, ignoring the fact that they were the ones who'd put us in this situation in the first place. My sister, sitting with them, was even more volatile. She stood up and started blaming me for her financial ruin, accusing me of being selfish and cruel for not supporting her. The irony of her words wasn't lost on me, but I stayed silent, watching as they all stormed out of the courtroom, leaving me behind. With them gone, the relief settled in. The debt was no longer mine to carry, and my financial record would finally be clear. My lawyer congratulated me, assuring me that this ruling would put an end to the entire ordeal. He also explained that, due to the ruling, if my parents tried to appeal, it would likely be dismissed given the strong evidence we had presented. They would have little ground to stand on. As news of the court's decision spread, I received messages from extended family members who hadn't reached out in years. A few offered belated apologies, saying they hadn't known the full extent of what had happened and that they regretted believing my parents' side of the story. It was nice to have their understanding, but at this point I realized I didn't need anyone's validation to move forward. This journey had taught me more about self-reliance than I ever imagined. Back in my own world, things started to fall into place. I'd been working hard at my job, and not long after the case ended, I received a promotion. It felt symbolic, a sign that I was finally stepping into a new phase of life. My friends, who'd stood by me through everything, celebrated with me, and I realized that I'd built a support network stronger than the family I'd left behind. With my finances restored, I started making plans for a fresh start. Moving to a new city sounded appealing, a chance to leave behind the memories of this turbulent chapter and focus on my future. I hadn't made any decisions yet, but the freedom to choose felt liberating. I was no longer bound by the manipulations and expectations of my family. My parents did make one last attempt at retaliation by filing an appeal, but as expected, it was dismissed almost immediately. The court found no grounds to overturn the decision, and they were forced to start repaying the loan themselves. This last effort seemed desperate, a final attempt to control the narrative, but it failed, just like all their previous schemes. In the days that followed, I took time to reflect on everything that had happened. This experience had been one of the hardest in my life, but it had also been one of the most important. I had stood up for myself, held my ground, and refused to let guilt and manipulation dictate my actions. I'd come out of it stronger, with a clear sense of who I was and what I valued. I posted a final update on Reddit, sharing the resolution with the people who had supported me all along. The response was incredible. People thanked me for standing up, shared their own stories of dealing with toxic family members, and expressed how much they'd been rooting for me. It felt like closing the last chapter of this painful saga, surrounded by a community that genuinely understood. I was ready to move forward, free from the weight of family obligations that had been forced on me for so long. My family had chosen to disown me, but I knew I wasn't alone. I had friends, supportive colleagues, and an online community that had my back. Most importantly, I had my independence. The journey hadn't been easy, but I wouldn't trade the lessons learned for anything. I was finally free to live my life on my own terms, with the strength to build a future that was truly mine. I'm a 30-year-old guy, working as a freelance graphic designer, and let me tell you, Thanksgiving this year was a complete disaster. Every year, my family gets together, and without fail, my cousin Kevin's name comes up. You'd think the guy walks on water with the way they talk about him. Kevin is a corporate lawyer, the golden boy of the family. He's tall, always well-dressed, drives a fancy car, and pretty much fits every stereotype of success that my family holds dear. Meanwhile, I'm just the guy with the art projects. This year, it started even before Kevin arrived. We were sitting around the dinner table, and as soon as the food hit the plates, my mom dropped the first comment. She didn't waste any time. Kevin really has his life together, doesn't he? She said, looking at me as if I was supposed to nod along and agree. I just kept my head down, focusing on the mashed potatoes. My freelance business has been doing pretty well recently, but none of them care about that. All they see is that I'm not making six figures in some high-powered job, and that's all that matters to them. The night went on, and the conversation kept circling back to Kevin. My aunts and uncles couldn't stop talking about him. Did you hear? Kevin's firm is grooming him for partnership. Oh, and he just got back from a vacation in the Maldives. It's like they're obsessed with him. I've learned to keep quiet over the years. No point in trying to steer the conversation when all roads lead back to my cousin. But this year, it felt different. I don't know why, but something inside me just couldn't take it anymore. As if on cue, Kevin made his grand entrance. He showed up late, of course, and the moment he walked through the door, all eyes were on him. He strolled in, flashing the keys to his new sports car like he was the star of a reality show. Everyone rushed over to greet him. I stayed seated, watching from the sidelines as they practically fawned over him. No one even bothered asking me about my life or my work. I'd recently landed a pretty cool freelance project with a popular indie brand, but it was like I didn't exist. Then came the kicker. During dinner, my mom leaned over and said, maybe if you had stuck to a more stable career, you could afford a place like Kevin's. I could feel my hands clenching into fists under the table. I didn't say anything, but inside I was boiling. It wasn't just the comment, it was years of hearing this same narrative. I know what they think. Kevin's the success story, and I'm the guy who could have done more. But here's the thing, Kevin's life isn't perfect. He's miserable in his high-stress job, and I know he's had more failed relationships than I can count. He's confided in me before about how lonely he is, but none of that matters to the family. They only see the surface, and they think he's got it all. Knowing that doesn't help, though. Even if I understand his struggles, I can't shake the feeling that I'm always living in his shadow. Then my uncle chimed in. He leaned over, half joking, Kevin could probably get you a job at his firm. Maybe it's time to get serious about work, huh? I forced a laugh, but inside, I felt like I was about to explode. It's like they don't even see me. I've built a career that I'm proud of, but in their eyes, it's not real work. They just can't respect it. After dinner, I found myself drinking more than I usually would. Everyone moved into the living room, and of course the conversation revolved around Kevin again. They talked about his recent promotion, his new car, and the vacation he just took. I tried to join in at one point, casually mentioning the freelance project I'd been working on, but before I could even finish, my aunt interrupted me to talk about how Kevin's firm is sending him to Europe for a big case. I felt invisible. That's when the memories started flooding back. Growing up, it was always the same story. Kevin was the kid everyone compared me to. At school events, family vacations, even birthday parties, it was always look at Kevin. Isn't he amazing? Meanwhile, I was just there. The other cousin. I don't know what came over me, but I couldn't stay silent anymore. The room got quiet when I finally spoke up. I said something like, you guys do realize I have my own life, right? It might not be a high-paying corporate job, but it makes me happy. The room fell into an awkward silence. My mom gave me that look, the one that says she's disappointed without even saying a word. No one knew how to respond. Of course, Kevin, being the golden child, tried to smooth things over. He flashed that polished smile and said something nice about my creative work. But it didn't feel genuine. It felt patronizing. That's when I snapped. I shot back. Thanks. But I don't need validation from someone who doesn't even know what happiness is. You could have heard a pin drop. Everyone was stunned. No one had ever spoken to Kevin like that, especially not me. My dad quickly pulled me aside, whispering that I was making a scene. But I didn't care anymore. I was done pretending everything was fine. Without saying another word, I grabbed my coat and walked out. I couldn't stand being in that house any longer. I was fed up with the constant comparisons, the feeling of never being good enough. As soon as I got home, I opened Reddit and vented. I posted everything. How I've been compared to Kevin my whole life, how Thanksgiving was the final straw, how I was sick of being treated like I didn't matter. The post blew up. Thousands of upvotes, hundreds of comments. People from all over shared their own stories of family comparisons, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel so alone. Late that night, I got a text from Kevin. Saw your post. We need to talk. Update 1. The morning after Thanksgiving, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. At first, I didn't even check it. I knew what it was. After my Reddit post blew up, I figured some family members would see it, and sure enough, they did. It was a mix. Some messages were supportive, but others were full of outrage. My aunt left a long voicemail, furious that I aired private family matters in public. Another cousin, who I hadn't talked to in years, sent me a message saying, I get it. I've been there. That one surprised me. Then there was the one message I had been dreading, my mom. Her call came around 10 a.m., and I could already imagine what the conversation was going to be like. I let it ring for a while, but eventually I picked up. She didn't hold back. She was upset that I'd put our family business online, demanding I apologize to Kevin for embarrassing him in front of everyone. It was all the usual stuff, like how I had to make things right and fix what I'd done. But this time was different. I didn't cave. I told her I wasn't going to apologize, not after years of quietly dealing with the constant comparisons. I made it clear that I was done pretending that everything was fine, and if they couldn't accept me for who I was, I'd have to step back. She was quiet for a moment, probably not expecting me to stand my ground like that, but eventually the call ended with her saying she was disappointed in me. It stung, but I knew this had to happen. Later that night, I got a call from Kevin. I wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe another lecture, maybe some passive-aggressive attempt at smoothing things over. But Kevin just wanted to talk. I almost didn't pick up. There was a part of me that wanted to just ignore him, but curiosity got the better of me. I answered, and after a short, awkward exchange, we agreed to meet the next day at a coffee shop in town. When I arrived, Kevin was already there, sitting at a table by the window, looking a little less put together than usual. He wasn't wearing his usual sharp suit, just a hoodie and jeans, which was weird to see on him. I sat down, and after a few minutes of small talk, he got to the point. He apologized. He said he didn't realize how much the family's constant comparisons had affected me. I nodded, but I didn't fully buy it. I knew he had to be aware on some level. He had always been the golden child, and I figured he enjoyed that role, even if he didn't admit it out loud. But then he told me something that caught me off guard. He said he hated his job. The long hours, the constant pressure, and the way his parents cared more about his success than his happiness, it was eating him up. He even said he'd been thinking about quitting for a while but had no idea how to break it to the family. He told me that all the praise, all the attention he got, it wasn't making him happy. In fact, it made him feel even more trapped. I just sat there, kind of stunned. For the first time, it felt like we were on the same page. I always thought he loved the attention, but hearing him talk, I realized he had his own frustrations, just like I did. We started talking more honestly than we ever had before, about how much pressure we both felt from the family. I told him about how being compared to him my whole life made me feel invisible, like nothing I did would ever measure up, and surprisingly, he told me he envied me. He said he wished he had the courage to pursue something he actually cared about, like I did with my design work, but felt too trapped by the expectations placed on him. Then he dropped the bombshell. He was planning to quit his job and travel for a year, to figure out what he really wanted in life. I didn't know what to say. This was Kevin we were talking about, the guy who had everything. And here he was, telling me he was about to throw it all away to go backpacking or something. Part of me was shocked, but another part of me respected him for it. It took guts to walk away from a career like his, especially when the entire family had been cheering him on for years. When he finally told the family about his plan, it went about as well as you'd expect. The same relatives who had been singing his praises just days before were suddenly full of criticism. How could you throw away such a promising career? What about your future? It was surreal to watch. All the admiration they had for him was crumbling in front of my eyes. I couldn't help but find a bit of satisfaction in it. For once, Kevin wasn't being treated like the perfect one. He was just like the rest of us, flawed and trying to figure things out. As Kevin started planning his trip, I found myself respecting him in a way I never thought I would. He was taking control of his life, doing what he wanted, not what was expected of him. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was living in his shadow. The family had finally stopped treating him like he was untouchable, and it felt like a victory, not just for me, but for both of us. A few days later, my parents called a family meeting to discuss Kevin's decision and, of course, my recent rebellion. I went, but this time I wasn't going to sit quietly. I told them straight up that if they didn't stop comparing me to others, I was ready to cut contact. I wasn't going to let them keep making me feel like I wasn't enough. There was a lot of tension in the room after that, but I didn't care. I'd finally said what I needed to say. As I left the meeting, I felt a strange sense of peace. I didn't know what was going to happen next with my family, but for the first time, it didn't matter. I was finally living my life on my terms, and it felt damn good. Update 2. 2 weeks passed after the family meeting, and I hadn't spoken to my parents since. Honestly, the silence felt like a strange mix of relief and discomfort. On one hand, I was emotionally drained from the whole ordeal, but on the other hand, I finally felt some peace knowing I had stood my ground. The last thing I said to them was clear. If they didn't stop comparing me to Kevin, I was ready to cut contact. It had left them stunned. And that silence? Yeah, that was them trying to figure out how to respond. In the middle of all that quiet, my phone buzzed. It was my younger sister. She usually stayed out of the family drama, but this time she called to say she admired how I handled things at the meeting. She told me she had been feeling the pressure of family expectations too, but never felt brave enough to speak up. Hearing that was a bit of a surprise, but it made sense. She's always been in the background, never causing waves, so I guess I never considered that she might feel some of the same weight I did. Meanwhile, Kevin was already making moves. I got a message from him saying he had sold his sports car and was downsizing his apartment, all in preparation for his big travel plans. The guy wasn't wasting any time. I couldn't help but be shocked at how fast he was moving, but I had to respect it. He was actually taking control of his life, doing what made him happy, and that was something I hadn't expected from him. It was strange seeing him shift from the perfect corporate guy into someone who was actively choosing to walk away from all that. But the biggest surprise came a few days later. I was sitting at home, scrolling through Reddit, when my phone buzzed again. It was my dad. Now, my dad isn't one for long conversations or emotional speeches, so when I saw his name pop up, I wasn't expecting much. But when I opened the message, I was stunned. It was brief, just a few words. "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself." That's it. It wasn't a long message, but coming from him, it meant a lot. For as long as I could remember, my dad had always been the silent type, never really showing much emotion. So getting this text from him felt, well, huge. Of course, not everyone was on board with how things had gone down. One of my aunts called me, clearly trying to guilt trip me into apologizing to my mom. She went on about how family comes first and how heartbroken my mom was. But this time, I wasn't backing down. I held firm, telling her that things had to change, and I wasn't going to keep living under the same weight of expectations. I wasn't rude about it, but I was direct. It felt like another small victory in a way, finally being able to set boundaries with them, even if they didn't like it. I kept updating Reddit throughout all of this, and the support I got from strangers was overwhelming. Every time I posted an update, the comments would flood in from people who had been through similar situations. It was almost like therapy. Seeing that other people understood what I was going through made me feel like I wasn't so alone in all of this. It gave me the validation I hadn't been getting from my own family for years. Then, one night during one of our catch-up calls, Kevin hit me with something I wasn't expecting. He floated the idea of me joining him on his travels, at least for a few months. He figured it would be a great opportunity for both of us to get away from the family pressure and just reset. I didn't know how to respond at first. The idea of taking off for a few months was tempting, but I had never been the type to take spontaneous trips, especially not with someone I had such a complicated history with. Still, it lingered in the back of my mind. A few days later, the silence from my parents finally broke. My mom called, and it wasn't the angry, demanding call I had expected. Instead, she was crying, begging me to come over and talk. She didn't understand why I was so upset, why I had been so angry, and she pleaded with me to mend things before they got worse. I agreed to meet her, but this time, I set the terms. I told her I would come over, but we were going to have a real conversation, an honest one, about how her constant comparisons to Kevin had affected me for years. She hesitated, but agreed. When I got to the house, things were tense. My mom was defensive at first, not understanding why I was making such a big deal out of everything. But as I started to lay it all out, how the Thanksgiving dinner went, how she always talked about Kevin's success without ever acknowledging my own, it started to sink in. I gave her specific examples, showing her how the family's obsession with Kevin had made me feel like an afterthought for years. At first, she was in denial. She kept saying that she only wanted the best for me, that she never meant to hurt me. But as the conversation went on, I saw a change in her. She started to realize how her actions, even if well-intentioned, had done some serious damage. She apologized, and though I accepted it, I knew this wasn't something that would heal overnight. My dad was there too, sitting quietly as usual. He didn't say much, but at one point, when I was explaining how suffocating their expectations had been, he nodded. That small gesture meant a lot more than any words could have. It was his way of acknowledging that he understood. The meeting ended on a cautiously positive note. My mom said she was willing to work on things, and my dad even offered to come to one of my freelance art shows, something he had never done before. I left feeling optimistic, but I knew it was going to take time for things to truly change. Later that night, I found myself thinking about Kevin's offer to travel. Maybe this was the perfect time to step back from all the family drama and focus on myself. I had spent years dealing with their expectations, and now I finally had a chance to break free, at least for a little while. I decided to go. I texted Kevin and told him I'd join him for the first leg of his travels. I didn't know what to expect, but I figured it was time to find out. Update 3. Departure day came fast. Kevin and I boarded the plane for Japan, our first stop. I hadn't traveled much before, so the whole experience felt surreal. The excitement hit me in waves, mixed with a little bit of anxiety. There we were, two cousins who had spent most of our lives tangled up in family drama, about to embark on this massive trip together. Before we left, we agreed on one thing: no family talk. This was our chance to leave all of that behind and just enjoy the experience. The first few days in Japan were a blur of new sights, sounds, and food. We dove straight into sightseeing, temples, bustling Kevinets, neon-lit streets at night. Kevin, for the first time in ages, seemed relaxed. He wasn't checking his phone every 2 seconds or talking about work. I started seeing a different side of him, one that wasn't tied to his career or the family's expectations. I wasn't sure what to make of it at first, but it was definitely a shift from the Kevin I'd known. One night, after a long day of exploring, we found ourselves at a quiet dinner spot. Over bowls of ramen, Kevin finally opened up about his decision to quit his job. It wasn't just the stress, he explained. It was the realization that he had been living a life dictated by what everyone else wanted for him. His parents, his bosses, even our extended family. Everything he had done up to this point was for their approval, and now, he didn't know what he actually wanted for himself. It hit me harder than I expected, mostly because I realized that we were more alike than I thought. Sure, our paths had been different, but we both felt trapped by expectations, his in being the perfect success story, and mine in being constantly compared to that success. The more we talked, the more the walls between us came down. For the first time, we were having a real conversation, not the surface-level chats we'd had at family gatherings. Kevin admitted that he had always envied my freedom to pursue what I loved. He told me that while I may not have had the money or prestige, I had something he didn't: passion. And in return, I confessed that I'd felt inadequate next to him my entire life. It was a raw, honest conversation that brought us closer than we had ever been before. Of course, things weren't perfect. A few days later, our first big argument happened. Kevin, being Kevin, wanted to plan out every detail of our trip. He had itineraries, backup plans, even spreadsheets of places we could visit. Meanwhile, I was looking to be more spontaneous, to just go with the flow and explore without a rigid schedule. The clash was inevitable. We ended up not talking for the rest of the day, both of us too stubborn to back down. By the next morning, we were both over it. We sat down and apologized. Kevin admitted that his need to control every detail came from his high-stress job, where everything had to be perfect. And I realized that my frustration wasn't really about the trip. It was deeper than that. It was about me still feeling like I had to prove something. We agreed to meet each other halfway. From that point on, we found a balance. Some days we followed Kevin's plans, and other days we let the day unfold as it wanted. Once we found our rhythm, the trip became exactly what I needed. We hiked through mountains, explored quiet temples, and even took a spontaneous weekend trip to the countryside. The more time we spent traveling, the lighter I felt. It was like shedding layers of expectation with every new experience. I started to rediscover my joy, not just in life, but in my work. I even pulled out my sketchbook for the first time in months, drawing scenes from the trip, things that inspired me. Throughout all of this, my phone buzzed with messages from home. My mom, mostly. She would send updates about how things were going, but I kept my responses short. I wasn't ready to dive back into that world just yet. Then one day, I got a message from my dad. "Hope you're finding what you're looking for," it read. Short, simple, but it carried a lot of weight coming from him. I didn't respond right away, but the message stayed with me. As Kevin and I continued our trip, he started thinking about what he would do when it was all over. He wasn't planning on going back to corporate law, but he didn't know what the next step should be. One night, I suggested he try consulting or maybe teaching law part-time. For the first time, he seemed open to the idea. It was a weird shift. Kevin, who had always been so sure of his path, was now considering something completely different, but it felt like a good change. One night, while scrolling through Reddit, I decided to post a reflection about how the trip had changed my perspective. I wrote about letting go of the need for family approval and how my relationship with Kevin had shifted from rivalry to mutual respect. It felt good to share, and the comments flooded in again, full of support and understanding. A few hours later, my mom sent me a text. She had read the post and said she was proud of me for following my passions. It was unexpected, but for the first time, I felt cautiously hopeful about mending things with her. By the end of the trip, I felt more in control of my life than I ever had before. I wasn't defined by family comparisons anymore, and for the first time, I felt truly confident in who I was. Kevin and I parted ways at the airport. He was off to his next destination, while I headed home. We both had a deeper understanding of each other now, something I never thought would happen. As I settled back into life at home, I couldn't help but feel like this was the start of something new. My freelance business was picking up again, and I had some big ideas brewing. And maybe, just maybe, there was something else on the horizon. But more on that next time. Update 4. Coming back home after my trip with Kevin felt different in a way I couldn't really explain at first. Everything about my apartment seemed smaller, almost like it wasn't enough to hold the new perspective I'd gained during our travels. But instead of feeling cramped or stuck, I felt more in control, like I finally had space to breathe. I had clarity, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't bogged down by the weight of family comparisons or self-doubt. I was ready to dive back into life, full throttle. The first thing I did when I got back was reconnect with my freelance work. I hadn't realized just how much stepping away would recharge my creativity. Within days, new ideas were flowing, and I was more inspired than I had been in months. I started collaborating with a few new clients, including a high-profile brand that I'd been eager to work with for a while. After locking in that deal, I posted an update on our freelance about the growth of my business. The support was overwhelming. It wasn't just the upvotes or comments, it was the recognition from people who understood the hustle, who'd seen me vent and now saw me thriving. As I settled back into my routine, my family started reaching out more often. My mom called and invited me over for dinner, and I noticed my dad was sending the occasional text, asking how work was going. It felt like they were trying, and while I appreciated the effort, I kept my guard up. I wasn't about to let myself get sucked back into those toxic comparisons that had ruled my life for so long. Eventually, I took my mom up on her dinner invitation. I was a little apprehensive, expecting the same old routine of hearing all about Kevin's latest successes. But to my surprise, things were different. She actually seemed interested in my trip with Kevin, asking about the places we visited and what the experience was like. For once, the conversation wasn't centered on Kevin's achievements or how I stacked up against him. It was almost normal. During dinner, my dad chimed in with something that completely caught me off guard. He said he was proud of me for making the decision to travel and focus on my passion. It was a simple comment, but coming from him, it felt huge. My dad has never been one for long, emotional talks, so to hear him acknowledge my choices like that was a bigger deal than he probably realized. It was the kind of support I hadn't expected, but it gave me even more confidence that I was on the right path. As the weeks went by, I noticed a shift in how my family interacted with me. My mom still slipped in the occasional rec Evan about Kevin, but she was quick to catch herself and change the subject. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And more importantly, I wasn't letting it get to me like it used to. I finally felt like I had control over how much their opinions influenced me. Then, something unexpected happened. A few weeks after returning home, I ran into Stella at a local art show. We had known each other from college, but I hadn't seen her in years. She was a photographer now, and we clicked instantly, bonding over our shared love for creative work. We exchanged numbers, and before I knew it, we were grabbing coffee later that week. It wasn't long before I felt something I hadn't in a while, a genuine spark. Around the same time, Kevin called me from Italy. He sounded happier than I'd ever heard him. He talked about his travels and the incredible experiences he'd been having. He even mentioned that he was thinking about not returning to law at all. Instead, he was considering a passion project he'd always wanted to pursue, writing a travel memoir. Hearing him talk about his future with excitement rather than stress was a refreshing change, and I found myself genuinely rooting for him. There was no tension between us anymore, no competition. We were just two people, each figuring out our own path. Things with Stella took off quickly after that first coffee date. She was supportive, encouraging, and genuinely interested in my work. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was with someone who appreciated me for who I was, without comparing me to anyone else. It was refreshing, and the relationship started to develop naturally. We spent more time together, and the more I got to know her, the more I realized how much of an impact she was having on my creativity. When I mentioned Stella to my mom, she immediately asked, "What does she do for a living?" Normally, that question would have triggered a sense of needing to justify or explain, but this time, I didn't feel that pressure. I simply told her that Stella was a photographer, and I was happy with her. My mom must have sensed that pushing further wasn't going to go well because she let the topic drop, something that definitely wouldn't have happened before. A few weeks later, another big opportunity landed in my lap. I was hired by a tech company to lead a design team on a major rebranding project. It was the kind of job I never thought I'd be trusted with before, and it felt like all my hard work was finally paying off. I shared the news on our entrepreneur, and the response was incredible. I couldn't help but reflect on how far I'd come since that first venting post. Speaking of reflection, I wrote another post on Reddit, summarizing the last few months and how everything had changed. My relationship with my family, my bond with Kevin, my newfound confidence, it all felt like part of a journey I was finally proud of. The post went viral, with thousands of comments and upvotes from people who had been following along since the beginning. It was humbling, but also validating to see how many people resonated with my story. Stella had a major influence on my creativity, too. Her photography inspired me to explore new styles in my design work, and we started collaborating on small projects together. I felt like my work had taken on new depth and meaning since we started dating, and I couldn't wait to see where our collaboration would take us. Now, I'm focused on the future. I'm planning to expand my freelance business, explore new creative avenues with Stella, and continue maintaining healthy boundaries with my family. I'm not fully healed from the years of comparison, but I'm on a path that feels right for me. There are big changes ahead, I can feel it, and I'm ready for whatever comes next. Stay tuned. Update 5. Months have passed since my trip with Kevin, and life has taken on a pace I never thought possible. My freelance business is booming. That tech company I landed as a client, they were so impressed with the work I did on their rebranding that they extended my contract, and I'm now managing multiple large-scale projects for them. It's crazy how much things have changed. I've never been this busy, but it's the kind of busy I love. I'm finally working on my own terms, doing what I'm passionate about, and getting paid well for it. It feels surreal to be in this position after all those years of uncertainty. Family life has improved too. My mom doesn't bring up Kevin in conversations anymore, at least not in the way she used to. The constant comparisons have faded, and we've reached a place where our relationship feels more genuine. There's still some awkwardness when we talk about career stuff, but it's not like before. My dad, in his quiet way, continues to show his support, and that's made a world of difference. It's funny how those small gestures can mean so much. It's not like the past is erased, but things are peaceful now, and I've found a sense of calm around them that I never had before. Things with Stella have moved forward, too. We're officially a couple now, and she's become a huge part of my life. We've even started talking about moving in together. It's something I never expected to happen so soon, but with Stella, it just feels right. She's been incredibly supportive, and for the first time, I feel like I'm with someone who sees me for who I am, not compared to anyone else. It's refreshing and, honestly, kind of amazing. Kevin, meanwhile, has been finishing up his year-long trip. He called me recently from South America, where he's been exploring for the past few months. He sounded more grounded than I'd ever heard him. He told me he's decided to write a book about his travels, blending his experiences with reflections on the pressure of living up to family expectations. I could hear the excitement in his voice, and I couldn't help but feel proud of him. Kevin's always been the golden child, but now he's carving out a path for himself that aligns with who he really is. It's a huge change from the person he was a year ago, and I'm genuinely excited to see what he does next. Kevin also dropped a bombshell. He won't be returning to corporate law, at least not in the way we all expected. Instead, he's planning to become a legal consultant for nonprofits and socially conscious startups. It's a complete pivot, but it aligns more with his values. When he told me this, I was amazed at how far we've both come in such a short amount of time. Neither of us is where we thought we'd be, but we're both happier for it. I've been thinking a lot about the role Reddit has played in my journey. Sharing my story with the community has been a big part of my growth. The support from strangers, the validation from people who've experienced the same family pressure, it all helped me realize that my feelings were valid. I wasn't alone. I wrote a post recently thanking the community for the encouragement, and the response was overwhelming. It made me realize just how far I've come since that first Thanksgiving post. Not long ago, we had another family gathering, this time for my dad's birthday. It was the first one in a while where the energy felt different. The usual tension I'd always braced for wasn't there. Instead of the constant comparisons, my family asked about my work because they were genuinely interested, not because they were trying to see how I stacked up against Kevin. Kevin was still abroad, but even in his absence, the dynamic had shifted. At one point, my aunt made an offhand comment about how Kevin must be making so much money with his new venture, but this time, I calmly responded, "I think we're all doing well in our own ways." No anger, no frustration, just a simple fact. My aunt looked a little flustered, but she let it go, and the conversation moved on. It felt like a quiet victory. When Kevin finally returned from his travels, the family threw him a welcome home party. But this time, it wasn't about putting him on a pedestal. The focus wasn't solely on his achievements or how he'd spent the last year. The energy was balanced. It was the first time I felt like the family saw us as equals. No more pressure to live up to someone else's standards. It was a weird but liberating feeling. During the party, Kevin made a short speech about his travels and what he'd learned. He thanked everyone for their support, but what surprised me was when he specifically thanked me. He said I had encouraged him to break free from the expectations that had been holding him back. I wasn't expecting that. It was a strange, humbling moment hearing my cousin, someone I'd spent years resenting, acknowledge the impact I'd had on his life. After the party, Kevin and I talked about collaborating on a project. He floated the idea of combining his travel stories with my design skills to create a website or platform where we could share his writing alongside my art. It's still just an idea for now, but it's something we're both excited about. It's amazing to think that after all these years of tension, we might actually be working together. Looking back, I can't believe how much has changed. My family, once obsessed with comparing me to Kevin, now sees me in a new light. They've finally stopped trying to fit me into a mold, and I feel like I'm accepted as my own person. As for the future, I'm focused on expanding my freelance business. I've got big plans, including hiring a small team to help with the growing workload. Stella and I are also discussing the possibility of starting our own creative studio together, which has been a dream for both of us. It feels like everything is lining up in ways I never imagined. Kevin finished his book recently, and I was one of the first to read it. It's raw, honest, and deeply personal, a reflection on the pressure of family expectations and the journey to finding one's true self. It resonated with me in a way that I hadn't expected, and I'm proud to have played a part in his transformation. As I close this chapter, I can't help but feel grateful for the journey I've been on. I've learned to live life on my own terms, without constantly seeking family approval. I've built a thriving career, found love with Stella, and redefined my relationships with both my family and Kevin. There may be more exciting updates to come, but for now I'm happy, at peace, and ready for whatever comes next.